Welcome to the NLP Talks podcast, bringing you inspirational stories along with a good dose of potentially life-changing NLP strategies. I'm Laura Evans, multi-award-winning NLP trainer, and I'm on a mission to help you unleash your potential in business and life. I'm so glad you're here. Pull up a chair, listen in, and let's get started on revealing more about this transformational NLP toolkit. Hey, how you doing? I hope you're safe and well. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of NLP Talks podcast. I'm delighted to reveal that today's episode is a deep dive episode into boundaries. Establishing boundaries is, I believe, one of the keys to a healthier relationship with both ourselves and others. These expectations, needs, and personal limits that we all have. And if something is consistently making you uneasy or feel stressed, it might be that it's a signal for a need for a boundary. For me, boundaries are all about self-care in various areas of our life. And we're going to cover the different types of boundaries and the benefits of healthy boundaries in this episode. Boundaries help create a sense of balance and personal well-being. And if people are encroaching on your boundaries, you may need to communicate that they're near to or have crossed your line or boundary. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about some top tips about how you can more effectively communicate your boundaries to others where you need to. I'll be referring to some great tips that I've learned by studying some of the work of Nadra Tawwab, who's written around the subject of boundaries. And I'll go on to share how, as an NLP coach, we often have a whole range of tools which we can use to help clients with boundaries. I'll be covering some of the NLP practitioner techniques and some of the master practitioner techniques. And I've included in this episode a little brief introduction to something called values level thinking and explained why I think values level 6 struggle the most with boundaries. So healthy boundaries with ourselves and others, I think, is something that many of us are work in progress towards in both our personal and work life. So let's go across to the main part of the episode as I start sharing why I think the 3 things are that stop us setting boundaries. So I want to start out by saying right up front that boundaries in this podcast episode is not about us beating up metaphorically other people and criticizing other people. It's about us being at cause. Cause is something that we talk about a lot in NLP, about us taking responsibility. And if your relationships are challenged or you're in a difficult situation with maybe a family member or a work colleague, the only person that can actually make a difference is us. We are the ones that have to either communicate, restate, or something else in relation to those boundaries, because if they're being run over by other people, then we've allowed that to happen. So this is not an episode where I'm going to be sitting here criticizing everybody else, more so about trying to equip you and I with tools so that we can be at cause, so that we can take some responsibility. Now, if you follow me on social media, you will be aware that I created an ebook to support this podcast episode called Creating Healthy Boundaries with Yourself and Others. And it deliberately is yourself first and then with others, because it has to start with us. And if you want a copy of this ebook, it's available for free on the nlptalks.com website. And you'll be able to go over there, find this episode once it's formally released on that website, and you'll be able to download a free copy of the ebook that goes with this episode. What is it, though, that stops us? What is it that stops us sometimes about even setting boundaries in the first place, let alone, enforcing those boundaries? Well, in my experience from the conversations I've had with people, it's really 3 things that stop us setting boundaries. Firstly, I think a lot of people feel guilty about setting boundaries. I think guilt is a massive thing in relation to healthy boundaries. We don't want other people to feel that we're being selfish. We don't want other people to feel like we're being unreasonable. And we feel guilty because of that. I think other things that come alongside guilt is the fear of confrontation or the fear of rejection, or indeed both. So, I don't want to perhaps set my boundaries or communicate those because I don't want other people to, create a confrontation for us to have an argument about them. Or indeed, I fear other people will reject me. I heard a story the other day of a young lady that went into medicine and she became a doctor. And when asked about, that career choice, she said, well, I did it because my parents expected me to. And there are lots of people that do things because it's expected of them. But the problem is this: you can't keep everybody else happy. It's one of the biggest lies, I think, that a lot of people tell themselves is that, but if I spend all my time keeping everybody else happy and sacrificing myself in the process, by default, I will become happy because they're happy. And I think that's actually a lie. I think we're kidding ourselves when we say that, because what brings me happiness and joy might be very different to what my family members think is happiness and joy, or my work colleagues. So I think what stops us from setting boundaries is this guilt, is this fear of rejection, and this fear of confrontation. Where, though, do we set boundaries, and what are the benefits of those boundaries? Well, benefits of having clear boundaries allow us to have less stress, to perhaps become less overwhelmed when we're clear about what we want in our life and what we want to progress. It has the benefit of shared understanding when we communicate those with others. Perhaps even bringing skills of enhanced communication skills or effective time management skills, because people that don't state and enforce their boundaries often end up having other people stealing their time. Now, stealing their time, or do we allow them to take our time, right? Notice there's a subtle difference. And there's been lots of evidence now around people with clear, robust, healthy boundaries having more resilience, better psychological safety, well-being, self-esteem. These are all benefits for having clear boundaries and having those boundaries understood. But not everybody needs us to explicitly state our boundaries. Most people will have the whereabouts to understand where someone's limits are, or what is or isn't acceptable to that person. And we are all different. But there may well be people in your life where it's necessary for you to communicate those. And I'm going to come on to talk about how you could do that and some language which you could use to do that. Because it doesn't matter how old you are. You could be a child, you could be a teenager, you could be an adult. And when other people encroach on your boundaries and your limitations, your expectations, that can be quite challenging. So I've identified in the ebook 8 areas or 8 types of boundaries. So I'm going to go through all 8. Now, what I would be encouraging you to do with this is get a copy of the ebook, okay? Because what I've done on the 3rd page of the ebook is I've put together a wheel so that you can rate each of these areas for yourself. So 10 out of 10 would be, yeah, I'm acing it. That boundary is good. I'm happy where it is. Or 1 or 0 might be, that's not a boundary I've really thought about. Or actually there are people that I'm allowing to roll over my boundaries, and maybe I need to communicate that with them. And that area needs some work. That's not to say, though, to be clear, that everybody needs to have very firm boundaries in every single area of our life. I don't want to suggest that they should be fixed and they should be stagnant, because they're not. They move. Think about experiences that you've had in your life, and you used to think one thing and now you think something else. by default end up talking on our NLP practitioner course about boundaries at the end of the course, because I say to students, when you arrive on the NLP practitioner course, you may well have, let's put it in a home context, been very happy to pick up after everybody else at home, to do all their washing, to put everything in the dishwasher, and happily you would be going about doing that in your house. And then you come and do some personal change work with me on an NLP practitioner course. And when you leave me after 7 or 8 days, it's absolutely possible, but some of those boundaries have moved. The fact that you might not be so willing to run around after everybody else and be picking up all their mess and picking up the dirty dishes out the kids' bedrooms, or, doing everybody else's washing and doing all the shopping, because all of a sudden what you believe about yourself and your abilities and what's important to you starts to shift. And you start to think, well, actually, do you know what? I am worthy. I am just as important as anybody else in this household. And actually, my time is just as valuable. And so what happens when we do personal change work is our boundaries can and do move. So I don't want to suggest that it's not a good thing, because it really is. When people do NLP practitioner courses and coaching, and they bolster up their self-worth, they bolster up their views of themselves, then boundaries can and do move. So I don't want you to think that boundaries are something that is fixed. I don't want people to listen to this episode and think, all right, I need to put up boundaries like physical walls that I don't let people in, because what happens then is we become isolated from other people. And that's not what we're designed for as human beings. We're designed to interact. So please don't think that I'm suggesting for a second you should be behind some kind of physical structure, if you like, to protect yourself. But there are some things that are going to be important to you in certain areas of your life. And if that's not clearly understood between you and other people, then you absolutely have the right to state that, to state what it is that you want or what you need, so that it's a healthy relationship, that you create. Take, for example, this is a different example of dating. When you first get into a relationship, one of the things that both of you are sussing out in the early days of any new relationship is boundaries. It's, what do you expect? What do I expect? How are we going to, interact? How are we going to respect each other's time? Physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, social boundaries, intellectual boundaries. And when you meet someone for the first time, if you're dating them, that's part of the fun, I think, of working out, what does one person want, need, or expect from the other, and trying to find a way through that. So there are lots of examples where boundaries are things that are quite important to us. And I think it's important to break down the types of boundaries that we may have. Now, I'm not saying these 8 I'm going to go through are the only ones. For you, there may be other ones. But as I'm just going to go through all 8, have a look at the circle, the wheel that I've put into the ebook for you. Or if you haven't got it, just as I'm going through them, listen to them and think, right, if I was to give myself a 10 out of 10 in terms of how comfortable I am, that I have healthy relationships in this area, or healthy boundaries in relationships in this area, then you give yourself a 10 out of 10. And if it's not, and you think, actually, some conversations I need to have with a few people, then you might give yourself a 5. Or if actually this is an area of your life where you have no boundaries, then you might give yourself a lower score. And by the way, your boundaries might be different with different people. So if you take, for example, emotional boundaries, how much you share of your vulnerabilities, your feelings, and so forth with one person might be different to someone else. For example, let's say that I have a sister, and I say to my sister something about my feelings and how I'm feeling about a particular situation. I say, don't tell mum, but I'm really struggling at the moment with X, Y, and Z, and I'm feeling a bit vulnerable in my relationship, and I'm just struggling a little bit. Now, if you tell her not to tell your mum, and then she tells your mum, she's gone across one of your boundaries. She has violated, is what they would call it, one of your boundaries. And you'll probably address that with her, hopefully respectfully, and hopefully in a way that is productive and helpful. And you might go, okay, I kind of said my piece, and that boundary is going to move a little bit with that person now. I might not be quite as open with them because I'm not sure that the trust is there as much. And if she does it again, then you might stop talking to her at all about all of that. So boundaries can be different for each person, but they can also be different in different relationships that we have with other people. So let's go through them then. So physical boundaries, this is the first one. So physical boundaries cover your physical being, your body, your personal space, and your property, i.e. your home. Now, your physical boundaries may include other things for you as well. And it also includes closeness, respect, and privacy. So, for example, when it comes to physical boundaries, there is this idea that we should consider how we feel having people in our personal space, how comfortable we are with having people very close to us. And some of us are very happy with that, and some people are not. So how do you communicate that with someone else, that you would need a bit of space? So these would be things like physical boundaries. It could be, people calling unexpectedly at your house. That might be something you're not comfortable with. So, you might need to say to your friend, next time before you pop round, just drop me a text, check I'm here. And that's a soft, subtle way of trying to enforce your boundaries so that they don't always just knock on the door and come in, and it's not always suitable for them to be there. So it doesn't have to be confrontational when you're enforcing boundaries or sharing or stating those boundaries, perhaps even in the first place. You've then got intellectual boundaries. So these relate to boundaries that we have about how we and others share with us opinions, thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and conversational topics. Some may refer to these as communication boundaries. So there are certain things that just are off limits in certain relationships, for example. You might have very, very different political views compared to another family member. And that might just be something that is something you don't want to talk about because you love that person, because you care for that person. And you might have very different opinions, thoughts, and ideas about what is right. But violating them might be when someone belittles someone else because of those boundaries, or perhaps being dismissive. Emotional boundaries is the third one. I've talked a little bit about this already. So this relates to feelings, trust, vulnerabilities, and healthy boundaries might include things like what, where, and how much of your emotional life you share or don't share with a particular other individual that you might interact with. Violations might include things like people invalidating your feeling or making fun of those feelings. Sexual boundaries. This might include emotional, intellectual, and physical aspects of sexuality, or our intimate relationships. So husbands and wives and same-sex partners and things. So our intimate relationship. And again, here there are boundaries, and for a healthy relationship, there needs to be clear understandings of limitations, desires, and consent, of course, is absolutely key. Violations in terms of sexual boundaries might be inappropriate touch or inappropriate comments. Wolf whistling here in the UK is something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So these would be where someone's boundaries perhaps have been violated. You've got material boundaries. So these are boundaries that relate to your possessions, money, and goods. And those items, physical material items that you have in your life that are important to you. And healthy boundaries and limits might be where you've decided who and what you're going to share things with. Violations of material boundaries might be where people steal from you, or damage things, or put undue pressure on you to lend them items that perhaps you might not feel comfortable with. There is time boundaries. Now, this is one that a lot of people struggle with in terms of how you use your time and use your time in relation to other people. Now, there may well be other people that pull a lot on your time and you allow them to do that. Or it might well be that you're not enforcing your own boundaries with yourself in terms of making sure that you have a balance between work and play, for example, time for hobbies, relationships, and self-care. Then you have your social boundaries. So these are all about the expectations and limits that we set in terms of our friendships and social interactions with others, and how much you let other people influence your actions. And then digital boundaries, again, one that comes up a lot in the coaching conversations I have with people, about setting boundaries and limits on your digital engagement, the amount of online content or the type of content which you're consuming. I know a lot of people these days limit the amount of news that they consume because news on the TV or online is always negative, and there's always something bad to report. Digital can also be about your boundaries, about what you're willing to share online as well. So there's 8 areas or types of boundaries there for you to think about. And as I was just talking them through, I think it's important to start to think about boundaries and what makes those boundaries healthy for you, and allow you to do, because this is ultimately about you. This is ultimately about your life, your quality of life, you having the time to do the things that you want to do, having balance in your life. Like, all of these things, are really, really important. So how do you go, okay, so that's all well and good, Laura, like I understand that there are these 8 areas and types of boundaries, but how do I start to identify what my boundaries are? Perhaps you've never even thought about this before. Well, the thing is, in different situations, first of all, to pay attention to what you're feeling in different situations. Now, Nadra, in a podcast episode I saw her doing, made a great suggestion, which was to pay attention to what you're complaining about. So if you're complaining that lots of people are calling into your house and you're not comfortable about that, well, that shows you there's a boundary there that people are probably unintentionally crossing. So perhaps it's something that makes you uneasy or makes you stressed. These all things might signal a need for a boundary, a need for you to identify and then communicate that with those people, that are impacted. But Nadra, in the podcast episode I watched, made a very, very good point, which was you shouldn't delay with sharing and communicating your boundary if you think one needs to be put in. Because let's say, for example, that you've gone years and years and years about not saying something because you've tolerated it, because you've put up with it. And then, 7 years down the line, you'll start saying to someone, well, actually, that's a problem for me. That's a concern for me. That's going to be a surprise for them, because they're going to sit there and go, well, hang on, for the last 7 years, you've not worried or bothered about that. How comes this all of a sudden it's a problem? So, her advice was certainly don't delay. And I think that's really sound advice in terms of once you've identified a boundary, then you need to communicate that. But this idea of what do you complain most about probably will lead you to identifying a boundary which someone perhaps has crossed over. The other thing you can look at in terms of identifying some boundaries that might be causing you some stress or unease in your life is knowing your values. And it's something we talk about quite a lot on our Master Practitioner course, because if honesty, for example, is something that's really, really important to you, that obviously is a value, and truthfulness then becomes, a boundary. When someone lies to you, they've crossed the line, they've crossed that boundary, and it's being able to know that is what it is, and choosing what to do as a result of that. And you could also try to identify boundaries in terms of past experiences and reflecting on those moments where other people may have crossed your boundary, perhaps once or perhaps even repeatedly. And that also can reveal your boundaries. So I'm not saying that in every single relationship you have to have them, these boundaries. But if you're becoming stressed, if you're becoming uneasy in a situation, it might well be because someone has crossed that boundary and, you haven't, for example, realized, perhaps you haven't even realized that's what's happened. And as I say, they can also shift over time, remember. Worth being aware of that. So if you've identified a boundary and you think that boundary has been crossed by someone else, then I think it's incumbent upon you to have a conversation with that person about that, and to start to get clear with them on that boundary. Now, in the ebook, I've gone through some guidelines here and some ideas about how to effectively communicate respectfully, calmly, clearly, and specifically. So what specifically is it that you're uncomfortable with? I statements are quite helpful when it comes to sharing where you're uncomfortable, and resist the temptation to get into debates with people about your boundaries. You don't have to justify your boundaries. You don't have to explain your boundaries. Other people don't have to agree with your boundaries. But what they absolutely would be asked to do is to respect those boundaries, if that's a line, if you like, that you've drawn, and someone else has crossed that. I think a lot of the stuff around boundaries focuses on self-care. Remember, your boundaries are to protect you. They're to ensure that you are able to look after yourself, for you to prioritize your well-being. But identifying and communicating those boundaries where someone might be innocently crossing them is one thing, but certainly your behavior is key. So let me give you an example. So let's say that you have a friend who calls you a lot during the day and texts you, and for you that's not acceptable. That makes you quite uncomfortable because you're at work, you want to be diligent at work. And so you find yourself having a conversation with that person and saying, look, I work obviously during the day, Monday to Friday. So, could I just ask you to be mindful of that? Maybe drop me a text rather than call me, because I'm going to find it really hard to answer calls during the day because I'm working. So you've identified a boundary, you've communicated a boundary, and, you kind of go, okay, great. But then the next day they call during working hours. You can see it on your phone, and so you pick up the phone and answer it. Now, maybe in your head you're thinking, well, I've already told them I don't want to call me during work hours, but they're ringing me. So perhaps in your head you're going, okay, well, maybe this is urgent. Maybe there's a crisis, right? And you answer the phone and you go, hi, is everything okay? And they go, yeah, I was just ringing to catch up. Now, inside, you're probably going, oh my goodness, I said just yesterday, I don't want you to call me during the working day. But the problem is this: you identified your boundary, you communicated your boundary, but your behavior didn't back up that boundary because you've answered the phone. So again, you may have to go back and restate that boundary, but you've got to be really careful that your behavior backs up the boundary that you've identified and communicated with that person. And you don't have to do it in a serious, heavy, confrontational way. I mean, you might use a bit of humor or a bit of lightheartedness, like saying to your friend, oh, next time, make sure you drop me a text before you come over just to check I'm here. You don't have to sit there and go, you've crossed my boundaries and you mustn't come to my house without calling. And, you don't say that. You casually can say these things. So these kind of tips are in the book for you, ebook. Now, what I've also done in the ebook, because I know this is a little bit tricky for some people, is I've actually given you some suggested statements in the ebook about things you could say. So going back to my example of the joke one earlier, there's a great example here, which is, I don't appreciate that kind of joke. Please don't say things like that around me. And again, that's okay, great. And the person's probably like to apologize to that. That's not difficult. Or perhaps someone is pushing you in an area to make a decision, then, and you don't want to be pushed, that making you feel stressed and uncomfortable. Then you could try and say, okay, yeah, thanks for that. I just need a bit of time to think about that. So you can do that. Perhaps you've made a decision about something and the other person is not agreeable to that. Well, they don't have to agree to the things that are involved with your boundaries. And there's a great example here. I've made my decision about this and I need you to respect it, even though you don't agree. So there's some great examples here that I found on the internet that I think are quite helpful. So I've put them in here for you as well. So like I say, it doesn't have to be a big conversation. It doesn't have to be a great big label on it going, we need to have a family meeting to talk about boundaries. Like, you don't have to make a big deal about it. But you can just say, hey, before you pop round next time, just give us a call and just check that we're here. You see, the problem is if you don't have these conversations about your boundaries, the real risk is that you become overwhelmed, the fact that you become overcommitted, and you might end up, spreading yourself too thinly. I mean, time and the digital one, if I'm honest, they're the two ones that I struggle with the most. I do have a tendency to scroll on my phone, and that's not a healthy boundary. But that's my boundary with myself. Right? You can't blame everybody else for, issues that you've created. Time, when you give other people time and you spread yourself too thinly, then, you have to take responsibility for that, right? You have to start to behave differently. Now, I've, again, in the ebook, put in an exercise here for you to do about things I will no longer tolerate, and identifying old behaviours and perhaps new healthy boundaries. So have a look at that. And I've also put in here some social media boundaries. It's okay to mute people online. It's okay to not respond. It's okay to block people. It's okay for you to take a break when you need to. It's okay for you to post about things that bring you joy, not because it's an expectation that other people think that you should. So it's quite an interesting idea, this idea of boundaries. But like I say, not everything relates to other people. Now, in the ebook, I've also done a section on evaluating your own boundaries with yourself, which is also a really interesting idea, because it's not always about other people, and a lot of people end up people pleasing, and you've got to stop to kind of think, well, how does that happen? Because we give our time to other people, we agree with things that perhaps we don't want to agree with, and how does that happen? I mean, during the pandemic, everybody was at home, right? Social isolation, if you can remember it. And, actually for a lot of people, that was actually really good. And they enjoyed the fact that there was no expectation that they had to go out. And then all of a sudden, lockdowns all finish and social isolation stops. And then all of a sudden, there's all these social gatherings again, and people feel obliged to go. People feel obliged to say yes. When actually they would really quite rather say no or find an excuse not to go. And it's really interesting because, what makes us do that? What makes us say yes when we really mean no? It's a really interesting one. Now, on our master practitioner program, we talk about values level thinking. And if you're a master practitioner and you've done values level thinking, you'll be familiar with values level 6. And I think boundaries, identifying, enforcing, communicating boundaries for values level 6 is probably one of the hardest levels, one of the levels that find it the hardest to set and live even by their own boundaries. So let me explain, in case you're not familiar with values level thinking, kind of how this all fits. Well, Values level thinking is essentially the predominant level at which we think. Now, different NLP schools train different modules. We're obviously accredited by the ABNLP, so they talk about 7 levels. Now, there is an argument that there's more than that, but certainly the personality profiling tool we use assesses 2 to 7. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into that. Maybe I'll do that on another episode. But values level 6 is a beautiful level. Values level 6 is people where their predominant thinking is focused on themselves, developing themselves, being the best version of themselves, doing the inner work, focusing on their growth. And for some, values level 6 can be quite spiritual. But one of the biggest drawbacks of values level 6 is this idea of sacrificing self for the benefit of others. So sacrificing self for the benefit of others. It's also a trap around acceptance and wanting to have other people accept us. And it can lead to people pleasing. It can lead to us not respecting our own boundaries around time, emotions, and all the things that I've talked about. And giving too much of themselves is something that I see quite a lot of in values level 6. So sacrificing self for the benefit of others, this idea that I'm not as important as other people, this idea that I should, I should go to the family gathering because it's expected, or I should go to the work party because it's expected. Can you hear the essence, the undertone of acceptance and wanting to be accepted by others? And it's one of the biggest lies I think a bunch of people tell themselves, which is that they fall into this trap that if they make everybody else happy, by default they'll become happy. And I think it's one of the biggest lies some people tell themselves, because you need to do what makes you happy, what fills you up, and you don't need permission to do that. And if you're needing permission, well, here it is. I'll give it to you. You have permission to do what makes you happy and what fills you up. I was having a conversation with a gentleman just yesterday, and I said to him, do you know what? You only come into this life with one person, and you only leave with one person, and that person is you. And when you leave this world, and whatever your view is of what comes next, but when you leave this world, you can't take your material possessions with you. Your soul, or whatever your model of the world is at the end of this lifetime. And you want to be able to sit there and think, do you know what? Have I done the things that make me happy? Have I done the things that bring me joy? Have I respected myself and my boundaries? Have I done the things that make me happy? And this same gentleman was an ex senior exec. And this conversation happened just yesterday, very timely actually. And he was telling me about all the things that he's doing for everyone else. This is typical values level 6, by the way. And he was talking to me about everything that he's doing for his family, everything he's doing for his employees, and the real difference he wants to make in the world. And he wants to make a massive impact, really positive impact on this world. And it's very noble and very commendable that people would hold that. But when I said to him, can I ask you just one question? What do you want? He drifted back into telling me about how he was going to develop his team and how he was going to support his family. And I went, whoa, stop. What do you want? Because if you continue to look for your happiness and your joy outside of yourself, you're looking in the wrong place. Because the joy and the happiness is in here, right? And for any of you that are listening to this, the master prac, we talk at length about externally focused people and how your source of love and happiness and joy, if it's outside of you, it can be taken away. Friends leave, they move on, family members die, all of those things. The only thing you have is what is inside of you. And actually, you have to stop and really think about it. And he even said to me, you've stumped me there. You really have stumped me. And I said, well, look at it from this perspective. What does an ideal day look like for you? And that also stumped him. Because when we actually got to the bottom of it, it wasn't actually really about keeping everybody else happy. It was the expectation his family had placed on him that he should prioritize them. It was his expectation on himself about the contribution he should make to this world and the footprint that he should leave behind positively when he goes. But actually, it's a really interesting one. I was talking to a coaching client just this morning about retirement, and so many people chase retirement, right? It's 10 years to go, it's 5 years to go, it's a day to go, whatever. And then they get there, and then what do you do with your life? Because you've lost your old identity of being the employee or the business owner that you were. And then you're left with, what do you want? What do you want? It's an interesting one. So I'm a massive fan of people identifying their boundaries, making sure that those boundaries are healthy, and that will be different for different people and different relationships, and for different ways that we can compassionately hold ourselves to account on our own boundaries, social media, time, and so forth. But I think more of us should spend a little bit more time honouring our own boundaries, honouring the limits and expectations that we have, because you cannot be everything to everyone else. And if you try to be everything to everyone else, then you are very much vulnerable to spreading yourself too thinly. We only have so much time and energy. Okay, your time on this planet is finite. At some point, the light will go out. And if you're going to spend the time between now and then comparing yourself to others, attempting to keep everybody else happy, then you've really got to stop to think, is that really what will make you happy? I remember talking to a coaching client years ago now about saying, she had a real problem with saying no. Now, if you go over onto my YouTube channel, there is a really great video, even if I say so myself, that I did on how to say no without feeling guilty. So if that's you, go and check out that YouTube video. Just go onto YouTube and search for me, Laura Evans, Unleash Your Potential. You'll find the channel, and then you'll be able to find that video and have a look. There's an ebook that goes with that one as well, actually. But here's the thing. When you say no to one thing, you create the space to say yes to something else. So rather than feeling like you should be out every Friday and Saturday night socializing with people, if you say no to just one of those, I'm not saying it's not one extreme to the other, okay? Please don't think that. But rather than going out Friday and Saturday night every week, maybe this week you just go out on Saturday. And on Friday, you are then saying yes to yourself. What could you do with that? What would you do with that? Would you go to the beach for a walk? Would you spend some time meditating? Would you have just a lovely soak in the bath? And actually, that's how you create time for self-care. That's how you bring more balance to your life. That's how you start to bring more joy into your life, in my view, anyway. I love this idea of compassionate accountability, and a few people talk about this in the area of boundaries. And I'm just going to read what I've written here in the ebook for you. Expecting perfection enables you to mentally beat yourself up when you fall short. Starting by working on your boundaries is the first step. Paying attention, identifying them, and starting to communicate where necessary. And doing this will enrich your life, stop you draining yourself, and free you up to bring more joy and happiness into your life. So, that senior exec, which I mentioned earlier, and when I finally got him to answer the question, what is it that you want and what does an ideal life look for you? He said, you know what? I'd love to get myself into a situation where I could go and walk on the beach every morning before I start dealing with everything else. And I said, and that is simply a decision away. It reminded me, in fact, of the old saying of put your own oxygen mask on first, right? So it's quite interesting. Now, when it comes to NLP and how can we really add value in the space of boundaries, there are a number of NLP techniques that I think really lend themselves to coaching conversations around boundaries. So a number of you listening to this podcast episode will be coaches, may well already be trained in NLP, or maybe aspiring to get involved in NLP. And so I'm just going to spend a little time just talking about some NLP techniques that I think really support people in having healthier boundaries. So one of the obvious ones, I think, in this space is meta-model questions. So meta-model comes from the language of specificity. The NLP community, Banda and Grinder, studied Virginia Satir. And there was this idea with Virginia Satir that lots of people globalize their problems. And actually, by helping people become very specific about their problems, she was much better able to help them find solutions. Okay, now it's a bit broader than that, but for the purpose of this episode, that will give you enough. And some great questions that you could ask yourself as self-coaching questions, as well as questions which you could ask a client if you were a coach, would be questions like, what specifically is the boundary here that we're talking about? So if you were a coach, then, no client's going to come into the coaching room and going, oh, I think I'd like to be talking about boundaries today. It doesn't work. But if you can hear that they're sacrificing themselves for the benefit of others, or they're not respecting their own boundaries, and if that's what you're hearing, then, you'd be legitimately able to ask those questions about, what specifically is the boundary here that we're talking about? What would happen if the boundary was set? So what would happen, and it doesn't have to use the word set, but identified, communicated, whatever. What would happen if the boundary was set? And what would happen if it was not set? So if you continue the way that you are and you don't take the action and you don't communicate where someone might be stepping over your boundaries, crossing the line, or where you're doing it to yourself, and what's the consequence of that? And what would happen if you continue as you are? It's quite interesting when you get into this. There's a really great one here that again, an NLP meta-model question, which I came across. How specifically can this boundary best be communicated as soon as possible? What would happen if you didn't communicate this boundary? How specifically will this boundary impact your well-being in terms of your energy, your engagement, your relationships, your joy, your happiness? How might it impact, or how specifically will it, setting this boundary, impact on other areas of your life, your physical health, your finance, your career, personal development, spirituality? So meta-model questions are all about getting really, really specific. Now, if you're also trained at NLP practitioner level or above, you'll also be familiar with intent and positive intent. And this idea that positive intent sits behind both setting it and not setting the boundary. If you're trained in parts integration, you will be well aware that both parts have the same highest intention. So again, an NLP practitioner or coach could well help a client by looking at some parts integration work about, what's the positive intent behind not setting the boundary? What's the benefit here? What is the advantages of not setting that boundary? And on the other hand, what is the positive intent behind setting it? And being clear, and see if you can find that positive intent behind both, because that will lead you to possibly some change work, which you could do with the client. But it's quite interesting when you start looking at that. So that's also things we could we could absolutely look at. In NLP terms, if you were coaching someone in the space of boundaries, it might well be that helping them build their confidence, doing some anchoring, circle of excellence might also help, because it takes courage and confidence when you've identified a boundary. Someone might have crossed that line. It takes confidence and courage to communicate that with someone else, and the confidence to say no. There may well be some inner work that needs to be done with the person around self-worth, whether they deserve certain things. So, there's maybe some limiting beliefs and stuff. So there's definitely probably some mindset work for a client that you're working with in relation to boundaries. Another NLP technique, which I think again lends itself to work within boundaries, is perceptual positions. This ability to disassociate and be able to be the fly on the wall, looking at past situations, looking at the different roles that might be going on. So if a client that you're coaching has some frustration with another family member or a work colleague, and boundaries are part of that problem, you could get them to do position 1 themselves, position 2 the other party, and position 3 the objective observer. Now, if you're not trained in NLP, these are all techniques that we train on our NLP courses. But if you are trained in NLP, you'll be familiar with these. Certainly, these are all tools that I think lend themselves very well to working with a client on boundaries. The other thing, if you're a master practitioner of NLP, the other thing that I definitely would be doing is looking at, for example, Cartesian logic as a tool to help someone really think through their boundaries. I also think work on values can be really important in relation to boundaries and what's really important to people. I think values lead us to the place where we might need to set boundaries in certain relationships or with ourselves. So I think, that also can be quite interesting. So the whole bunch of techniques, ways of thinking, modalities that we have access to that I think really would enable an NLP practitioner or a coach to really help a client where boundaries, have become a problem for someone. So boundaries is a massive topic, and in this episode, I hope that I have enabled you to understand boundaries a little better. Healthy boundaries with yourself as much as healthy boundaries with others. But learning to set healthy boundaries takes time, okay? So this is not a magic wand, it's a process. Boundaries should only really be set when it's right for you, not because someone else tells you to. And be kind to yourself, because you don't always get it right the first time either. Remember, it's normal to have different boundaries with different people and situations, and it's normal for boundaries to move and change over time. They will and do. But what's important is that you realize when you're doing something or someone else is doing something that makes you uncomfortable, makes you uneasy, is making you stressed, and having the courage to identify if a boundary needs to be put in place, and the confidence to communicate that boundary as well with that. Now, if you're in a relationship that might not be safe and people are exhibiting behavior towards you that are harmful and abusive, then please seek out professional help from charities that can support you and guide you to take further steps. There are many great charities all the way around the world. If you're in a relationship where someone else is violating and crossing your boundaries and you've attempted to deal with it and you can't, there's lots of great organizations out there that you can help. And of course, if you really do want to get underneath the skin of boundaries and you really want to get underneath the skin of the mindset shift that you could make, then if you haven't yet, I would highly recommend you come and have a look at doing our NLP practitioner course, because as I said at the very beginning of this podcast episode, it's a really common thing when I sit at the end of a practitioner course with an amazing group of people that I've supported through the program, and we get to the end and, I say to people, so, like at home, where before you were happy to pick up after everybody else, and you might not be so willing to do that now. And a lot of people raise an eyebrow and nod, and I say, well, do the rest of your family and those that are close to you a favor, and just have a conversation about some of the changes you've made this week, and at least help them to understand some of the change work. They won't get it, but at least help them to understand. And inadvertently, this is a hint and a nudge from me to our students to, really start to communicate, where things have shifted positively for them, and not everybody else has to like or agree when your boundaries shift. So there you are. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast episode. It's a very different topic than I normally cover on the episodes, but I was asked to cover boundaries and relationships, so I hope I've done the topic justice. And if you haven't already, then go over to nlptalks.com, where you can download a copy of the ebook that I've been referring to today. And if you're a coach, I hope it helps you help some of your clients get clear on some of their boundaries, and help them bring more joy and happiness and balance into their life, improving psychological safety, well-being, and so forth. And if you're listening to this podcast episode and I have helped you in some way, then I'm super happy that this episode has enabled you to perhaps have the courage and the confidence to create some healthy boundaries with yourself and with others. So this brings us to the end of series 7 of the NLP Talks podcast. I'd like to stop to take a moment to thank every single guest who has joined me on the podcast episode. I will be back very shortly with a summary of the whole of series 7. And then series 8 is actually not that far around the corner, but I will reveal more about that in the next episode. But thank you so much for joining me. I really hope that you have enjoyed this episode and this content. And if you have any ideas of things you'd like me to cover on the NLP Talks podcast, then please drop us an email. info@unleashyourpotential.org.uk. So info@unleashyourpotential.org.uk. And if you'd like to find out more about our NLP trainings, then please visit our website, unleashyourpotential.org.uk. So take care until next time.